Welcome to the Holistic Health Bites podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Nicholson, crime scene investigator turned functional health investigator. This podcast is here to share bite-sized episodes and unique interviews on a wide variety of health topics to empower, enlighten, and educate you to live your best, most vibrant life. Disclaimer: all information you hear on this podcast is for information only and constitutes individual opinions of the person speaking. This should not be taken as medical advice. Being a listener of this show does not initiate a practitioner-client relationship between you and the hosts or panelists on this show. Please discuss these topics with your medical professionals before making any changes to your health. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome back to the Holistic Health Bites podcast, where we discuss all things metabolic health. Today, we're talking about histamine overload. Histamine is an inflammatory mediator. It's vital to our immune function, but as with many substances in the body like cholesterol, estrogen, and insulin, too much of a good thing can become problematic or even debilitating. Histamine overload, or histamine intolerance, as you will often hear it referred to as, is where the amount of histamine in the body outweighs the body's ability to degrade and eliminate it. So you have too much supply and not enough clearance. Histamine comes from a lot of different sources. From outside the body, we primarily get it from our foods, but we also produce it inside the body, and our microbes also produce it. So inside the body, we make histamine in response to various immune threats, like allergens, bacteria, fungi, viruses, all of these sorts of things. But then the microbes that live in our gut also can produce histamine as a part of their normal metabolism. We break it down inside the body using two different enzyme pathways, DAO and HNMT. In a healthy, balanced body, the DAO enzyme is produced by our intestinal villi, which are the little finger-like projections on the inside of the intestinal lining. And to a lesser degree, we make the same enzyme in the kidneys and in some other tissues. This enzyme is responsible for handling the histamine that's present outside of our cells that are generally coming from food and those that are produced by the microbes in the gut. Damage to the intestinal lining can impair the production of the DAO enzyme, though. And we know, as we've talked about on multiple episodes on this show, that a lot of people have gut dysfunctions, whether they know it or not. It's really actually pretty easy to damage that intestinal lining because it's only one cell thick. It's really easy to damage, and so there's a lot of people walking around amongst us who have damaged intestinal lining, and therefore probably have less production of the DAO enzyme. There's also genetic alterations that can cause some people to be slower at producing DAO. This enzyme also requires copper and activated vitamin B6 or P5P as cofactors. So if you have deficiencies in these things, you won't be able to make or activate your DAO enzyme. Now, DAO is found throughout the body in all of the organs, but it's in the highest proportion in the small intestine, which is what's helping us break down the histamine coming in with our food. It's also prevalent in the kidneys, the thymus, and the placenta. The placenta is fascinating. It produces high amounts of DAO during pregnancy to protect the fetus from excess histamine. So this is a really interesting clinical pearl, is that a lot of times people find while pregnant, their symptoms go away. So somebody who may struggle with chronic migraines that didn't have any during pregnancy could actually point to histamine being the cause of the migraines. So it's an interesting way to assess if histamine might be part of the problem. Now, of course, that doesn't mean run out and get pregnant. There's lots of other ways to assess this. But if you happen to look back at your own life and realize that, oh, yeah, that's true, I didn't suffer with X, Y, or Z symptom while I was pregnant, it could be the histamine is behind it. Another great clue that you can use, outside of being pregnant, of course, is if antihistamine medications dramatically improve your symptoms. So, for example, they often will prescribe certain kinds of antihistamines to people who have anxiety or who struggle to sleep properly, because histamine promotes being awake and being more hypervigilant. So that can create an inability to sleep and some anxiety. So if antihistamines actually help reduce anxiety and help you sleep, it could be a histamine problem. Now, the other enzyme, HNMT, is responsible for handling the intracellular histamine, so the stuff that's found inside the cells. This enzyme helps control the amount of histamine in the brain and helps to break down the histamine that's acting as a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Again, there are genetic variants in the HNMT enzyme that can cause a slowed clearance of the histamine. This enzyme also requires B vitamins and several minerals to be active, such as molybdenum, copper, selenium, and zinc as cofactors. So deficiencies in any of these can interfere with proper enzyme function. This one also requires methylation. Methylation is a complicated topic. We could do an entire episode just on methylation. But basically, it's just the process of passing a chemical group called a methyl group from one compound to another, and that spurs various chemical reactions and is required for lots of things in the body. Methylation is required to process this intracellular histamine. When histamine gets degraded using the HNMT enzyme, it ends up forming a metabolite that can no longer bind to the histamine receptors. Cells throughout the body have receptors for histamine, and this is why you can have symptoms in every system in the body. The symptoms of histamine intolerance are widespread and can vary greatly between different people. So it can be hard to pinpoint since the symptoms can come and go, and they can even rotate around the body based on where the histamine is attaching. So really, proper balance is key. So here are just some of the symptoms that might point to histamine being your problem. If you struggle with anxiety, if you struggle with any kind of allergies, excess mucus secretion, contributing to sinus congestion, postnasal drip, frequent sneezing, and even some hearing impairment that can be due to changes in the eustachian tube. You might have asthma, especially exercise-induced asthma. Blood pressure swings, either high or low, brain fog, dizziness, fainting, vertigo, edema or any kind of swelling, flushing, excessive sweating, fatigue, flushing, a wide variety of gut issues like acid reflux, bloating, gas, diarrhea, early satiety, meaning you fill up really quickly, nausea, vomiting. You might have headaches, especially migraines. You might have trouble sleeping. You might have insomnia, mood issues such as irritability, anxiety, depression, or panic attacks, motion sickness or seasickness, PMS or PMDD, skin issues such as itchiness, rashes, eczema, hives, urticaria, dermatographia, angioedema, and very itchy bug bites. You might have tachycardia or a rapid heartbeat. You can see that this can show up in a wide variety of ways. Histamine can be tested in the blood, but due to the fluctuating nature of histamine, one-time measurements may or may not actually show the elevations. There are also tests for the DAO enzyme in blood serum. There are stool tests to assess histamine-producing microbes, and there's a lot of other test options out there. But remember, some people struggle with high histamine due to high exposures or lots of production, while other people struggle with these symptoms because they're not breaking it down or clearing it very well, and some people have both. So it's important to try to get to your personal cause and therefore recommend the appropriate remedy for your actual cause. Now, the easiest way to determine if histamine overload is true for you is to do an experiment. Implement a low histamine diet for 2 weeks and also take a DAO supplement before meals. If histamine overload is a key driver in your case, you should experience significant relief. Foods high in histamine are typically aged or fermented in some way, as histamine is being produced by bacteria in those foods. So these would include dairy foods, especially aged or fermented dairy, such as kefir, yogurt, sour cream, and aged cheeses. processed meats, such as deli meats and bacon and sausage, things that have been cured or have just been around for a while. Fermented alcohol, such as beer and wine, especially red wine. Foods made with yeast, such as bread. All fermented or cultured foods, such as vinegar, and any condiment made with vinegar, such as salad dressings and ketchup. This also includes sauerkraut, kimchi, miso, kombucha, and soy sauce. Canned fish, such as anchovies, sardines, and tuna. Fruit juices and dried fruits. Bone broth. Leftovers, which increases the histamine the longer they are left over, that you're actually aging your foods in your refrigerator. Some foods that are not fermented or aged are still naturally high in histamine, including avocado, eggplant, cooked tomatoes, and spinach in large quantities. Now, some foods will produce histamine release without actually having high histamine levels themselves. So these can include other kinds of alcohol, chocolate, eggs, bananas, and many citrus fruits. Diets very high in protein can also be part of the problem, as mast cells, or one of the most important parts of the immune system, use the enzyme histidine decarboxylase to make histamine out of the amino acid histidine. A low histamine diet can be really hard, but it doesn't have to be 100%, and it's certainly not a long-term forever diet. This is used as an experiment to figure out if the histamine really is the problem. And then as you work to address bacterial imbalances, other causes for why you're reacting so much to the histamine, then you can bring those foods back in. So this is not meant to be a forever diet. A significant reduction in histamine intake, along with the DAO supplementation, should be good for a sufficient trial to see if histamine really is your problem. If this experiment confirms that you have a histamine overload, the key really is to find the true root cause and then address that. This could be that you need some dietary changes. You need supplemental enzymes or cofactors because of genetic issues or gut imbalances or whatever's driving the inefficient enzymes. You might need to address your gut health and get rid of bacteria that are producing too much histamine. You might need to explore your genetics just to understand where your enzyme production is. You might need to correct the nutrient deficiencies. If you're lacking those cofactors, these enzymes aren't going to work very well. You might need to look at certain medication use, like chronic antihistamine use or NSAID use. Hormone replacement with estrogen can also drive up histamine. So if you're taking birth control pills or hormone replacement therapy, any of those kinds of things that have estrogen, that can contribute to histamine overload. Certain types of exercise can drive it up, stress of all kinds can drive it up, and even toxin exposures such as mold can interfere with proper histamine management. So much like we discussed a couple of weeks ago with regard to magnesium deficiency being a common contributor to so many symptoms throughout the body, you can see that histamine overload can also be responsible for a wide variety of health issues. And this is likely far more common than we know. If you believe histamines may be at play with your symptoms and you want to explore the true root causes of your persistent symptoms, apply to work with me. The initial intake session alone may just change your life. Until the next, be well and vibrant. Thanks for being a faithful listener to the podcast. Did you get value from listening to this show? I'd love it if you left me a review on this podcast so that others can more easily find this valuable information. Did you know I also work one-on-one with clients and my practice is entirely virtual? I approach solving health challenges like I approached solving crimes, by conducting a thorough investigation into your case. Sadly, hundreds of millions of people in the US have poor metabolic function, insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes, and the vast majority have no idea because their doctors aren't looking in the right places. I'm here to fix that without unnecessary medications. If you struggle with low energy, stubborn weight, hypertension, sleep disturbances, or any other undesired symptom, and you want a natural, lasting approach to correcting the problem rather than masking symptoms, apply to work with me. The link is in the show notes.